Hey, welcome back. I'm John F. Gately. You can call me Jack, broadcasting to you today from beautiful Plymouth, Massachusetts, behind enemy lines. Let's take a look at the virus and two things that I think that we're doing completely wrong in looking at this epidemic. And that's not only here in Massachusetts, but pretty much everywhere else throughout the country. And these two things that we're going to talk about in today's video are not really new. But what is remarkable to me is that we still haven't changed how we're looking at the virus. We've seen some movement on one of those items very recently, but with also a lot of resistance. Maybe it's now a good time to take a look at a review of where we are. To better understand any type of public policy decision or problem, you've got to have a good idea of the scope of the problem. And second, you've got to have a good idea of the acuity of the problem. And we have a better sense of these things, we can make better policy decisions. The funny thing is this has not been, refined since like the beginning of the pandemic. We're still looking at the pandemic with the same lens or the same tools as we were in March of 2020. So let's first take a look at the scope of the problem. That has to do with testing, and then after that we'll take a look at looking at the acuity of the problem. Let's go to the chalkboard. Okay, so you got two basic types of tests. Here in Massachusetts, as of December 9th of this year, 21, we've had over 10 million tests done in Massachusetts, just to use Massachusetts as an example. PCR test, antigen test. PCR test is something that's done in a lab. The antigen test is usually or can be done at home. It could also be done like at your local doctor's office, but the beauty of the antigen test is that it actually can be done at home. PCR test, you have to go to the doctor's office and or the hospital. So out of our 10 plus million tests, 9 million have been PCR tests, or 85% of all tests. 1.5 million have been antigen, about 15%. Resulting in a positivity rate for PCR tests at 9.9 and 6.9 for all antigen tests. Now, you might say, hey, that's only 3%, it's no big deal. But actually, from a percentage point of view, it's like 40% more, which really skews our view of the epidemic if the PCR test is not accurate. So I said to myself, what's with the discrepancy? Why the big difference between these two? And to my shock, that's already been covered, but not corrected. The New York Times wrote a story about this in the summer of 2020, and then they updated it in the summer of 21, talking exactly about why your PCR test might have come out positive, but shouldn't have been. Let's talk briefly about the difference between a PCR test versus an antigen test. As I said, the PCR test is done in the lab. The antigen test can be done at home. You can buy them on Amazon. A PCR test is a test that, the best way to look about it is like taking a photograph and enlarging it so that you can see inside the photograph. And when you enlarge your sample after, the nurse stuck it up your nose. When you enlarge the sample and you look far enough into it, you can almost find anything that you're looking for. In other words, you know what? Why don't we have Dr. Fauci explain it? Because he's going to tell you, in other words, if you look too closely, you can almost find anything you want, including virus that is non-replicable, if that's the word. He uses the right word, that can't replicate. In other words, you're not infectious. You're not infectious. It's remnant virus. But it's still counted as a positive. Let Dr. Fauci explain.
All right. There have been a number of reports of patients who shed viral RNA for weeks, as determined by PCR. It doesn't seem to be infectious virus. And the real question is, are they a threat for transmission? And I'm wondering if you think we could use a cutoff of viral loads determined by PCR to say this patient is no longer infectious, can go home, can go to a nursing facility. Because right now the physicians are really having a hard time with that.
Right. Again, a good question. And what is now sort of evolving into a bit of a standard that if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule.
You see, with the PCR test, you can almost discover anything if you look closely. Here is the biologist, the doctor that invented the PCR test, Carrie Mullins.
If they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay?
Unfortunately, we can't get his current take on the virus because he passed away in August of 2019. Before all this happened, it would be very interesting to find out, unfortunately, what he would think about where we're at right now. By the way, you should also know that he won a Nobel Prize for discovering the PCR technology and test, so he is most certainly an expert. The problem is that most labs, not consistent with Dr. Fauci's recommendation, cycle up or enlarge the photo beyond 35. In fact, the New York Times discussed this in their article. And if you look into the FDA documents that were submitted by Quest and LabCorp, which are the two largest testing facilities, at least probably in the country, definitely here in Massachusetts, they admit that their cycle rates or thresholds are somewhere between 37 and 40. In other words, they're looking too hard for the virus. They're looking for the virus so hard they actually find remnant virus, which gives you a false positive, or as some doctors have called it, a late positive. Because this can be virus that, or remnant virus that was in your system from when you were infected a while ago, and you're no longer infectious. But now we're redirecting resources to you, especially if you're in the hospital for something else. We're redirecting resources to you, even though you're a late positive or a false positive. It doesn't matter. PCR test, you're going to get the full COVID treatment, even though you might not need it. In data acquired by the New York Times, they indicated that we might be overstating the Massachusetts virus problem by 85 to 90%, which is extraordinary. Or in New York State, they looked at results from the lab in New York, and they understood that they were overstating the results by 43%. I think even for me, overstating it by 85 or 90% seems an extraordinary. How could that possibly be? So from understanding the scope of the virus, we very well might be, because Quest and LabCorp are ramping up the cycle thresholds to 37, 38, 39, 40, they're looking for and discovering remnant virus. You really only need to have cycle rates of 30 or less before you find infectious virus. There's a total difference between infectious virus and remnant virus. Also, with the PCR test, and this is how we're going to talk about the antigen test, with the PCR test, you don't really get that until you're feeling, really not well. Then you make a doctor's appointment, you get into the doctor, that might be the next day, and the PCR test then takes 24 to 48 hours. My kids just had it. It was 36 hours before they actually got the result back. They were negative. How does that compare with the antigen test? The antigen test, you also take a swab, but you can do this at your kitchen counter or kitchen table or from your bedside at home. And it's kind of like a pregnancy test. Not that I've ever taken a pregnancy test because men can't get pregnant, But, you take a swab, you put the little activator liquid on it, you slide it in there, you cover the thing, and you wait like 10 minutes. Now, the problem with that is that not everyone has fantastic scientific technique, and you can have mistakes. You get a phone call, put the swab down, and you know what I'm trying to say. There can be some human error in it. But if you're really sick, how do we fix that? Because approximately 10% of antigen tests are incorrect. How can that be fixed? Well, if you really don't feel well, you should A, stay at home, get yourself a bowl of chicken soup, and then retest yourself. It's very possible that you do actually have the COVID virus, but there hasn't been enough in your system yet to make it detectable by the antigen test. If you wait 5 or 6 hours, if that's, feasible, make your own healthcare decision. Don't take it from me. I'm not a doctor. But if you wait 5 or 6 hours, highly likely you take the antigen test again, then you'll know for sure if you're positive. So the advantage of the antigen test is that deployment is very, very quick, and the rate of failure is something that can be managed by retesting fairly quickly. Dr. Minna at Harvard University gives this analogy. If you were going to buy a car with an airbag, and they gave you a choice of airbags, one that went off every single time, but it was 2 minutes late after the accident, or another airbag that didn't go off every time. It only went off 90% of the time, but when it did go off, it went off instantaneously with the impact. Which airbag would you want? Of course, you'd want the airbag that went off instantaneously, even if it only went off 90% of the time, because if it's 2 minutes late, yeah, it's too late. So why haven't we fixed that? These seem to be fairly easy public policy things to fix. Well, in Florida, in December of 2020, they did fix the PCR problem of enlarging the sample too much. The Florida Department of Public Health now requires labs to report the cycle threshold to the Florida Department of Public Health. So there's transparency on these results. My kids got tested the other day, as I said. I called the doctor's office and I tried to get the threshold number. They wouldn't give it to me. But in Florida, they have corrected that, but not here in Massachusetts or other places. In New Hampshire, within the last couple of weeks, last week or two, the governor of New Hampshire made 800,000 antigen tests available to New Hampshire residents for free. They sold out, so to speak, wildly successful, and now they're getting more. But if you ask the federal government, for instance, the White House spokesperson, whether that is feasible or not, they say that's not feasible. Even though they've recently added a reimbursement for the antigen test, that is not the same as actually giving it out for free. We, of course, do give out the vaccine for free. We've spent billions of dollars to give out the vaccine for free, but we won't do it for something that can be so easily deployed and quickly deployed at the home level, probably for a lot less than the PCR testing. We won't do it for antigen testing. Here's Jen Psaki, White House spokesperson.
Complicated though. Why not just make them free and give them out and have them available everywhere?
Should we just send one to every American?
Yes, Jen, we probably should send it to every house in America. Yes. So those are two things we could do right away. One, cap the cycle threshold at 35, as Dr. Fauci recommends, and required reporting to the Department of Public Health in your state so there's transparency about the cycle thresholds by the big lab companies, which are making a lot of money doing these PCR tests. And two, we can launch a massive, even though Jen Psaki doesn't want it, antigen test distribution program for free to people at their house. That way they don't have to wait 2 or 3 days to actually get, so they could stay at home and get a quick result and know what this is, so they don't infect people. It's mind-bogglingly simple, but we haven't done those things. It's almost as if some people don't want to do those things. So that covers the scope. Let's talk about acuity. Actually knowing how acute the problem is. How many people are actually dying of COVID as opposed to with COVID? Jack, what are you talking about? Well, in most states, the statistics are melded together. Let me give you an example. Many men, especially as they get older, into their 80s or 90s, they die with prostate cancer. They don't die of prostate cancer, they die of heart disease or something else. But they also have prostate cancer. The average time between when you're diagnosed with prostate cancer, you die is like 17 years. So it's a long time. So you're not dying of prostate cancer, you're dying with it. But the way we do our COVID statistics in most states, and including here in Massachusetts, is you're a prostate cancer death. If we were to do it the same way they do COVID. Let me explain. Give you another example. You are out cleaning the gutters. You fall off the ladder. Of course, it's not the fall, it's the sudden stop that really does the damage. You fall off the ladder. You go to the hospital. You tested for COVID by PCR test. That's routine once you get there, and they fix your broken leg and everything. And a day and a half later, they find out that, in fact, you are testing positive for COVID. You now become a COVID patient, which means that there's all sorts of protocols for that, and it's going to be a lot of misdirected resources because you're really not a COVID patient. You're a fall off the ladder patient. If you die, you're a COVID death. That makes no sense. And I know you've heard about this before, like in the early part of the epidemic last year, 2020. But it's never been corrected. And so how can we really know who's actually dying of COVID as opposed to with COVID, like you died like with prostate cancer? Because we don't differentiate that. If you fall off the ladder and you happen to test positive at the hospital, you're a COVID death. That makes no sense because you really can't get granular on it. We don't know how many people are actually dying of COVID as opposed to with COVID. And I'm sure there's some middle ground where the COVID is a aggravating, so there might actually have to be 3 categories. In whatever case, there has to be a protocol put together so we can get more granular on that. I'm not a doctor, but from a public policy point of view, I do have a master's degree in public management. I don't have enough data. I don't have enough granular data to be able to make proper policy decisions. So again, we've got to move to antigen testing, which is rapidly deployable. And even though it's somewhat inaccurate, there's a solution for that. You can get retested very quickly within hours. And 2, we've got to be more granular with our data. How can you, as a leader, recommend a lockdown or a mask order or requiring every kid to wear masks in school? Any of these things. How can you do that if you don't really have data to support it? Now, I would totally understand when March of 2020, April of 2020, May, June, even July, that was we've never lived through this. Nobody was alive that's alive in 1819 or whatever, for the most part. And I totally would get it in 2020 if we didn't have this granular approach or this antigen test approach. But it's December of 2021, a year, almost 2 years later. Our leaders are failing us to do this. And it perpetuates the virus forever, right? It becomes like a never-ending pandemic, which, if you haven't noticed, there's a lot of financial benefit to continuing to be tested. There's a lot of financial benefit to individuals and corporations for getting all of this money for the test, all the government money that's going into this. But we're looking at it the same way we were in March of 2020, but now it's December 21. We need to change our approach. It's time. And if we do this, we'll have a much more granular look at the virus, and also we'll be able to respond to it and allocate our resources specifically to those who are actually sick, not to people who were sick. Hey, I'm John F. Gately. You can call me Jack, reporting from beautiful Plymouth, Massachusetts, behind enemy lines. Have a great day.